conservative is consistently paranoid, if you will. Maybe that's putting it too strongly, but bothered by the capacity for civilization to go awry. It is a worldview that allows a person to put a multitude of things in their life in an appropriate hierarchy. Congress is broken, and there's a number of interesting ideas or suggestions to how we might fix that or address that. And I'm for kind of an experimentation. Some of them kind of radical, like maybe remove the cap on the House of Representatives rather than limit it to the 435. We can make it thousands and thousands so that the odds of you personally knowing your representative increases.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Riddell Lewis. I am the host of the Purple Political Podcast. Podcast focused on discussions, solutions, maybe debates in there. Who knows? But for the most part, I ain't swayed by political bias. I ain't swayed by the political toxicity or the social toxicity. I'm just here to find good conversations, find solutions, and not fettered by other people's opinions. We focus on the facts. You feel me? Today is going to be a very interesting episode. This will be episode number 17, as we're going to be talking about what is a conservative and does the United States need conservatives? And this is going to come from the point of view of a conservative himself. I am not conservative, obviously, but I know quite a bit from that side. So it's going to be fun, very interesting. I'm going to ask a couple questions. We're going to really dive into what it really means to be a conservative. All right. Now, before we dive into the meat and potatoes of today's episode and my guest, I'm going to go over the review that we got from the podcast. So every episode, every guest episode, so to speak, I do plan to bring more content coming soon. Every guest episode, I'm going to reveal a review. So leave a review to get shouted out on podcast. This review said, I found this podcast very educational. I find it revolting how the states and our government reallocate funds from our taxes to fund projects the public is unaware of. While listening to the latest episode, I found out that in Texas, families are charged nearly $410,000 in taxes for education just for the state to reclaim that money and not use it for improving the education system. It's a fraud. What happened to no taxation without representation? We need a political reform on values, and the government and state officials need to be re-educated on what the word integrity means. Thank you for being a voice that shares multiple perspectives. That is what we're here to do. I believe that was that episode. I don't know if it was one of the pilot episodes on the other name of the podcast, but I believe that was one of the episodes where I had a former Democratic electee come on and talk about Texas politics. And I think we talked about the education system. A very good episode. Highly recommend checking that out. My guest here today is Josh Lewis. I already kind of did the intro and everything. That's what I do beforehand. And really just once you appear, we go right into it. So to start out, can you introduce yourself? Tell them what you're about, all that good stuff.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. I look forward to a great conversation and great discussion. I am the founder, as it were, of Saving Elephants. That's a podcast, a blog, a social media platform that is interested in introducing my generation, presumably yours, millennials, to conservatism, to the intellectual tradition of conservatism in the United States, and trying to show why it still holds value for younger Americans. And the name itself, Saving Elephants, is a play on word, in that it is a recognition that the direction the Republican Party and, for the most part, large swaths of the right in the United States have gone in recent years is problematic and is likely not going to end well. And so it's almost a calling back to an older version of some of these understandings.
All right, excellent. Very interesting. For the most part, I've talked to a lot of different people. I talked to liberals, I talked to Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, libertarians, the people who identify as nothing, and the people like myself that's pretty much in the middle for any kind of topical discussion. So today I want to talk about what is a conservative and does the United States need conservatives? So that's right up your alley, of course. So first thing I want to kind of really dive into is how did you become a conservative and why? Both.
It's hard for me to trace the moment I identified as a conservative, say. It's probably fair to say I grew up in a relatively conservative family background structure, and never really moved from that. I would like to think that I've deepened my understanding of what that means. And in my earlier years, I've always been interested in politics. And although I don't share this basic mindset now, I got a lot of my start by listening to talk radio back in the day. It's way more flamboyant, way more antagonistic, needlessly so, in my personal opinion, than what conservatism should be. But it nonetheless got me interested in politics. And I think maybe it's fair to say my disposition has always been a conservative outlook. Over the years, I've kind of added the political philosophy on top of that conservative disposition, if you will.
All right, fair enough. I get what you mean. For the most part, you kind of have a framework of values, and then kind of align to an ideology, so to speak. Um, Very similar in a sense. I was definitely all over the place because obviously growing up, the being a black man, the you're automatically put in the Democrat liberal kind of section, the left section, and then obviously I have family that's religious, so that's very much more of the right section. And then I went to a liberal arts college, so more liberal stuff. And then I went to the military, so more red stuff. So I was getting basically everything, every opinion from both sides until I kind of grew up and kind of found my core beliefs. I found that, yeah, I'm kind of more just in the middle. Some people, I agree, some here, but I don't agree totally with everything everybody says. So, I definitely understand where you're coming from. Can you explain what it means to be a conservative?
I don't know. Maybe I can try. I can give it a fair shake. That is
Go for
a
it.
surprisingly difficult thing to explain, but I will give us some frameworks that maybe we could work with. And let me start off very briefly with a caveat being, if you were to get another guest on that goes by the label conservative, their politics may differ greatly from mine. I'm under no delusion that I'm representative, say, of the entire right. Sometimes these days, if you say someone is very conservative, what that actually means is an adherence or uh, an affinity, say, to Donald Trump or to some specific leader. That's not
Yeah.
what I necessarily mean by conservative. Now, you could like Donald Trump and you could vote for him and be conservative, but it's not just that. When I say conservative, I had earlier I think that's where it starts. The conservative philosopher Sir Roger Scruton put it best. He says conservatism begins with this idea or notion that all reasonable people share, which is that good things in this life are easily destroyed, but they're not easily created. And so, at root, what a conservative is someone who says, what are the good things in life that are easy to destroy, but they're not easy to create, that we need to conserve? And so, for that reason, a conservative begins with gratitude as a founding ethos or emotion or overriding principle throughout life. What are we grateful for? We start with that, and then how do we build off of that? And it might be easiest to think of that in juxtaposition with the left, oftentimes the progressives. Their notion is not to begin with gratitude, rather it's to begin with a sense of justice. What is right? What is wrong? How do we pursue what is right? Neither of these, incidentally, are bad. These are both very good virtues. But the conservatives' first inclination is to start with what do we have that we should be grateful for, and how do we build from that?
Okay. All right. Um, for the most part, I definitely can see what you mean in terms of like kind of aligning with specific figures such as Trump. You know, the tag conservative very much. I mean, they kind of put all these tags all together with conservative, right, Republican, um, basically all those people. They kind of put them all in the same basket for the most part. Um, in terms of conservative, when it comes down to, I always assumed that was more so the aspect of, you know, like you said, and I had a great discussion with someone before regarding conservative liberalism, and from the explanation that I got, it was more so that the conservatives tend to want to keep the things the way they are in terms of, like you kind of said, in terms of what they deem is right. You know, kind of making sure we're not going too far into some crazy land and all that stuff. Now, you could definitely see that the reaction from the conservatives nowadays because of like the new things with like the LGBTQ, for example, and not want to stray from that, and the religion, people stray from religion, all that stuff. So when it comes down to it, people will tend to say that conservatives, or I've heard people say stuff like conservatives are uh, afraid of progression, afraid of progressing with the time, unwilling to do that, and make it, and they end up getting the slurs or getting the tags of, hey, you're racist, you're homophobic, all that stuff. So, what do you say to these people who believe that conservatives are not able to kind of progress with current generation moving forward and just want to go back in the old days where, everything was ran by old white men, is as they say. So,
Well, that's a big topic, and um, obviously there are some that would go by the label conservative. That I don't know that that would be an unfair criticism of them. As I mentioned earlier, it's a gratitude for something that we have to hold on to. That naturally can lead to a fear of the unknown, or an adherence to the status quo. Now, sometimes the status quo needs to be changed. So a conservative ought not to be an individual who simply stands against all change. They also ought not to be a person who simply wants to return us to some sort of an imagined past. There are various forms of conservatism. You mentioned religious, cultural conservatives, those that are trying to conserve some form of American Judeo Christianity heritage, say, or maybe trying to conserve a sense of the culture wars of, this is the good old uh, American values, and we ought not to have these radical wokist agendas come in here and upset the apple cart, if you will. Maybe conservatives trying to conserve some sort of an economic order, capitalism, for instance. And all of these can fit within conservatism. I really think the broadest understanding, and not all conservatives would agree with this, but the majority would, is really what we're trying to conserve is the founding tradition that we were given from the founding fathers at the birth of the nation, and kind of this continuing project of moving toward a more perfect union through a system of, I'll call it ordered liberty, say. That being said, I do want to answer your question more direct, because this is sort of an argument within conservatism is, okay, well, are conservatives nothing more than someone who just wants to apply the brakes, or someone who's just, the old guy shouting at the kids, get off my lawn. I just want to, let's take us all back to the 1950s. And I think that if all conservatism is a disposition, then yes, there's a good danger it becomes that. So it has to be more. It has to be some sort of a, what is our end goal? What is our maybe I won't say end goal. What is our vision for what kind of a nation we want, and what do we conserve in order to hold on to those things that can build toward that sort of a nation? And I do apologize. Your question is so broad. I'm having a hard. I feel like I'm not really answering it because there's so many pieces I could get to. Do you want to clarify? Is there a more specific part of this that I could answer for you?
so I think we'll be able to break it down as we continue discussion. I have a couple more direct questions in terms of conservatism,
Sure.
because it is a very very broad question and very big topical discussion right there. So before I dive into conservatism a little bit more and get your feedback from it, I just want to ask your general opinions about, what do you think about liberals and what do you think about moderates?
Well, I'm probably fighting a losing battle here, but when I say liberal, I tend to mean classical liberal. In other words, an individual who is Thomas Jefferson, for instance, would be a classical liberal, one who holds liberty as an orienting virtue in society. Oftentimes, when we say liberal these days, what we really mean is the political left, or progressives, right? Those who see a role for a more aggressive state to do good in the lives of the citizens. Um, so maybe for that, if we're using that paradigm, maybe I could call liberals the moderates and progressives what you mean by liberal. Um, I think weirdly conservatism is trying to conserve liberalism. In other words, it's trying to conserve those things that give us liberty. And so I don't want to whitewash this answer as if, hey, we all agree on things. Clearly we don't. But I think that there is some sort of a common kinship between conservatives and liberals, in the sense that the disagreement is not so much on the question of liberty, ought there to be or ought there not to be, but rather, how do we define liberty? How do we defend liberty? Where does liberty come from? What is the proper response to the tug of war between liberty and order, say? A conservative sees our liberty as an inheritance, something that grew gradually over time through multiple generations of change, and not something strictly that is brought about by principles. In other words, we don't simply say we have a right to be free. Say we don't have a right to free speech, and therefore that's all we need is just to write it down. We have a right to free speech. The conservative says, well, that's cool and all, but it's way more important that we have a society that respects the right to free speech rather than that we just demand it, say. And so it's that sort of an understanding is that a conservative is consistently paranoid, if you will. Uh, Maybe that's putting it too strongly, but bothered by the capacity for civilization to go awry, the capacity for us civilized people to become barbarians, to return to our pre civilized roots. And that is very necessary in a free society to have intermediary institutions like the church, like local organizations like the family, that temper our desires so that we can live in a free society. And the more we ignore that at our peril, eventually freedom doesn't work anymore. Eventually, we are no longer free because then we become enslaved in a sense to our own passions.
Okay. What about the people who kind of temper from the progressives and the conservatives and right in the middle? What do you think about those people?
What you're calling a moderate, I'm assuming?
Yeah.
I think moderation can be viewed on two different planes. And so it depends on what we mean by a moderate. If by a moderate somebody says, I don't agree with the people that stormed the Capitol on January the 6th. I also don't agree with the people that were rioting in the streets in 2020, right? So if we take some extreme examples between the left and the right, then I'm a moderate, so far as I can tell. If what we mean
Right.
by moderate is that I don't agree with an individual who elected to Congress, say, is literally using their position to undermine the opposition. They have nothing of value to offer. They're just trying to score points for their team and trying to enact, the phrase on the right is often, we're trying to get liberal tears. There's nothing of value we're giving. We're just, it's almost as if inflicting pain on the other side is its own value. And that could be very benign. It could even be funny. It could be something we might agree is entertaining and not all that harmful, or it could actually be violent and something we
Yeah.
might agree is no, we can't have that. By that definition, call me a moderate. I'm someone who wants to stand between those two. However, oftentimes moderate means almost a picking and choosing of ideological presuppositions, if you will. That there's a notion that somehow by arriving at the middle of all policy decisions, or by arriving at the middle of all ideologies or all political philosophies, that is the straight and narrow. And I think that sometimes it makes sense to be a radical in those moments. I think uh, if we're Americans circa 1860s, say, I don't want to be a moderate on the question of slavery. There are certain things that it doesn't make sense to approach from moderation.
Okay. Yeah, I think you said very interesting things there, and I do agree with some of the sentiments you brought up. That in those situations where there is an extreme circumstance, then yeah, I definitely agree that a radical movement is necessary in those situations. And for the most part, I would agree in terms of your kind of definition of moderate, in terms of picking and choosing. I don't necessarily think. Well, when you look at the brand grand brush of moderates, for the most part, they mostly align with the side, but they don't want to identify with that side. I think it's
Sure.
very hard to identify as moderate for most people because you're either have if you have some type of religious or military background, you are leaning conservative, whether you like it or not. And then if you are definitely more of the LGBTQ or big time in terms of liberal studies or the arts, for example, or big into social justice, you're definitely leaning more into like the progressive liberal side, right? And those people who try to identify as moderate won't be able to kind of articulate why they're a moderate because their foundation is one way or the other. That's why I think if you're going to identify as moderate, you have to have a logical basis that kind of differentiates yourself from those two kind of sides, which is, it's hard to do with all the noise all over the place. Even your friends and family members can be noise in terms of trying to lean you one way or the other. So I definitely think it's very hard to be a moderate, but I do think it's possible. I.e., myself. Um, so with that said, I want to dive into conservatism a little deeper. First things first, could you give a pro and a con of being a conservative? And then my second question, follow up that I'll tell you now, a pro and con of current conservatives, so the people in the United States. So being a conservative, and then the people that are conservatives right now, pro and con for both.
That's a really good question, and I might have to think about that for just a second. I think the pro for being a conservative, at least the sort of conservatism I hope to advance and argue for, is that it is a worldview that allows a person to put a multitude of things in their life in an appropriate hierarchy. That it doesn't elevate politics as the most central thing in our life. So when I say conservative, I'm not talking, obviously, I'm a conservative politically, but it has to infiltrate more than just that. It's an orientation of my life. It's sort of an anchoring of how important are politics, and at what point do they need to take a backseat to something else, and how do I orient my life in a manner that is, as I said earlier, trying to conserve the good things that I was given. That's more than political. That's my family. That's my faith. That's the things I see in my life that I value, that I didn't create them. Thank God I've got them, and I'm going to do what I can to hang on to them. That would be the positive. I do think that there is I don't know if this is fair to call it a con, but I'll throw in this category. I think that conservatism necessitates a certain level of sobriety. And this is oftentimes why you will see younger people tend to be more left, and as they age, generally speaking, they tend to become more conservative. Sometimes that's because we get old and cantankerous, and to hell with everybody, and that's more a conservative kind of hard-hearted attitude. But sometimes
Yeah.
what that means is there's a certain amount of sobriety necessary. That conservatism means you're having to give up on certain almost more utopian or optimistic views of how the world could be. And you're having to accept, this isn't perfection. This is not paradise. This will never be paradise. Every action, politically speaking, could have an opposite and equal reaction. That there are trade-offs. There's no such thing as pure solutions to our problems. But and we can advance the ball further. I'm not arguing against progress. It's just it's a sort of a pessimistic view about the possibility of us truly advancing as a species, because who you and I are right now is not that much different than who we would have been 2,000 years ago. We're the same basic stuff. We just happen to live in a different civilization that's imprinted on our brains, a different story that allows us to live in a civilized world. And so that necessitates, or can become, a very dour, very downcast look at reality. It can be buoyed by things like hope, by things like gratitude, but it can become a more difficult view because you are of necessity saying that this might be wrong, this might be unjust, but our capacity as humans to truly bring about justice is limited.
Okay. Okay. What about the second question? The pro and con for conservatives today in the United States.
Are you talking about like
The
particular
people,
politicians or
just the general, as a general people, like your general depiction of conservatives throughout the United States.
it depends on how we're defining conservative. I'll start with a con on this one. If by conservative we mean those who were taking, I don't want to say radical because that would be the opposite. The view I mentioned earlier, that I said, if by moderate you mean one who does not try to inflict liberal tears, say, if that's what we mean by conservative, then it is a very unhealthy impulse. It is very destructive. It leads to things like January the 6th. And honestly, if that had never happened, it leads to individuals in their own hearts and minds behaving as if half of this country are somehow not real Americans, and that they don't count in some sense, that they're not part of a unified whole that we just happen to have very deep-seated disagreements with, but they're just not worthy, if you will. And that in effect, what we're not trying to do is conserve the good, or let me rephrase that. We are trying to conserve the good, but it's almost Noah's Ark situation. We're trying to build our own ark to get our own people inside while everybody else is left out in the cold. And I think conversely, conservatism in the positive sense for the people can be just the opposite of that, which is the American project has to be a franchisement and an enfranchisement for everyone. That if we have large swaths of the population that don't see themselves as part of this greater American project, that's a problem not only for them, but it is for us too. And we need to work to find a way to make bridges across, not necessarily that we would agree, because we're never going to live in a world in which we all agree about everything, but that we don't have large pockets of the population that dislike the situation so much that they just want to tear apart the institutions as they exist and they don't see any hope in reform. Did I
Okay.
answer your question? I feel like I may not have completely grasped it, so I'll give it another try if you feel like that was an unsatisfactory answer.
No, I definitely understood where you're coming from, and I want to touch base on that answer again, because I want to follow up on another point. But what on also pro? You have a pro of current conservatives in the United States.
Like the current elected officials, is that what we're or thought leaders, or how do you mean?
I'm mostly when I'm talking about the conservatives, I'm talking about the general depiction of conservatives because you mentioned a lot. Because you when you mentioned the general depiction of liberals, you basically classify them as progressive, not the
Mm.
current kind of notion of or the classic notion of liberals. So, kind of same way, what was your a pro of the general depiction of conservatives as of right now in the United States?
I would think the pro is that it is a, this might sound like an odd one, but conservatives, historically speaking, way more than the left, in my view, or at least from my perspective, spend a lot of time fighting each other. Spend a lot of time trying to define what is the good, what is liberty, how do we secure liberty, what are our higher principles? Are we just trying to slow the car down? Or are we trying to put it in a particular direction? And if so, how do we orient ourselves against the left or those who would not want to see the car go that direction? And so I think that tradition has continued on to this day. Now it's a little muddier than maybe it once was, and I think sometimes if you read the conservative intellectuals of old, they had far better versions of the arguments we're currently having. Um, but those arguments are still ongoing. And I think that sort of tension within a movement allows for, through process of time, the betterment of that movement, that it often comes up with better responses to the problems we're facing because it's not blindly adhering to sort of a lockstep uniform view of how the world ought to be.
Okay. So I want to follow up on the current conservative point a little bit, right? So you mentioned a lot of there in regards to conservatives and how they should be versus how they are as of right now. And my question to you is, in terms of conservatives, do you what do you think about this aspect of currently? It's unfortunate, but it's definitely the truth in terms of general depiction. Anytime someone who is adamantly racist, adamantly homophobic, transphobic, etc., they are always bunched into the conservative aisle. Always, right? And for the most part, it's not just like some random liberals and lefties that are always doing this because they do that all the time. But these people are identifying as conservatives as well. The people who are adamantly racist, adamantly homophobic, adamantly transphobic, and I can even say this from experience, because I make a lot of middle content, right? So I come through different situations based on what I think logically makes sense. And I try to use facts, and I don't really try to use emotion when I'm depicting what I'm depicting. But and the same for the other side. They're just as annoying regarding this. But in terms of the conservatives, I will have these, people come in. I say something, even though I try to advocate for both sides. They hear something, they get triggered. It's obvious that they are homophobic. It's obvious they're transphobic, but they're calling themselves conservatives. So what do you say? What do you think about these people who, for the most part, are kind of making the connotation of conservative very negative nowadays? So what do you think about that?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm glad you brought it up. That again is another big issue that I will likely give an unsatisfactory answer for, but I'll do my best. I think, as a general rule, there was nothing innately about conservatism that necessarily leads to racism or homophobia. Conversely, as a general rule, your observation is correct. I don't know that I go so far as to say all, or such a vast majority. It doesn't even make sense to talk about the minority. But I'm perfectly comfortable saying most racist, most homophobics would identify themselves, if not outright conservative, at least on the political right, or at least it's far rarer to see that on the left. Um, there are some complex reasons for that. Some of it is historical. Some of it is by nature of what conservatism is trying to do, is to conserve something. I think sometimes individuals who, as I was mentioning earlier, sometimes people can conserve the wrong thing. Sometimes people can take conservatism to mean we need to roll the clocks back to some preconceived era in which things were right with the world. And that doesn't always mean, but it can mean a time in which, just to put it bluntly, white America was essentially running the show, right? That was far less diverse of a culture. Um, Not necessarily in terms of just sheer numbers, although that was true, but in terms of who had the political and social and cultural power within the United States. If you look at conservatism from a historical perspective, and there are a number of people who did this, Matthew Continetti in his book, The Right, George Nash in his book, The History of the Intellectual Conservative Movement, Know Your Enemies, which is a podcast, interestingly enough, that takes a view of conservatism from a very left perspective, but nonetheless gives it a fair shake. They all have to contend with this issue and this question. To what degree does racism play a role in the broader conservative movement over the past century, say? And all three of these groups, organizations, or books, or individuals say it's complicated. Now, if you come from the left's perspective, there is a tendency to say racism is the natural end point of conservatism. That someone like, say, a Donald Trump, and I'm not necessarily saying Trump is like the archetype racist, but Trump is what you get when you push conservatism to its extreme. If you come out from somebody like Continetti and Nash's perspective, who themselves are conservative, they say, no, no, no. Those elements have always been there. It's sort of a populist nativism, if you will, within the conservative movement. It's sort of an overall feeling. And what is necessary, therefore, is for intellectuals and leaders and political organizational leaders, say, to channel that energy in a direction that is not racist, in a direction that is far more interested in um, viewing the higher principles of what it means to be human, and not necessarily what it means to be our particular skin colors. And in certain eras, we have seen um, leaders such as, more say, like the Ronald Reagan aspect of it, who have come to the fore and have led us more in that direction. In other eras, we've seen the more odious elements. Again, I'm not trying to call Donald Trump the archetype racist, but Trump, say, George Wallace, although he wasn't necessarily on the right, um, to a certain degree, Patrick Buchanan, some of those who would channel that energy in a more destructive direction. This is a big topic, and there's a lot more I could say here. I don't want to get on a soapbox about it. But this is certainly a con. It's in conservatism. This is certainly something conservatives have had to deal with, and it's something that, as a younger conservative, I've often said, if conservatism survives, it's going to have to deal with this issue head on, because the reality is the United States is becoming increasingly diverse, not only in terms of population, but just in terms of its outlook. That it is less and less and less, thank goodness, tolerated to have bigoted ideas about people of other skin colors. And if there is a political movement that is in any way entangled with that, they aren't going to survive much longer as the younger generations become older, say, and the older generations die off. So this is a real problem. It's something I don't have a simple solution for. Uh, and it is something that is, again, I don't want to say unique to the right, because if you go back, if you go back in our history, there have been plenty of instances in which the left, especially in the progressive era, I mean, we're just outright racist. Talk about Woodrow Wilson or some of the Southern Democrats of that era would make the racists today blush, if you will. But this is certainly a problem currently on the right, and it does need to be dealt with.
All right. So, yeah, I mean, the liberal stuff, I very much agree. The big point here to really focus on is like the vocal radical minority is so loud that they are seen to be representing the side that they are a part of. And the liberal left has that problem. We already know what the wokies, all that stuff. So the liberal left has their problems, and I'll definitely have a podcast episode very similar to this where we talk about that. But in terms of the conservatives, my question following up that is, if the assumption by many leftists is conservatives are racist, homophobic, all the other stuff, and the potential assumption from even some moderates also align very much to that conclusion. And not only that, you know that there are those people in the organization. What is the point of staying conservative and not moving on to a different type of political ideology?
Well, I think that if we, and maybe it's not possible, but if we could remove for a moment the question of race and racism from our minds, conservatism is a coherent political orientation um, that it would be unrealistic, say, to ask a conservative to adopt a completely different political orientation that's out of alignment with their values and with their worldview. Um, it might be realistic to say, what is it about conservatism that allows for racism to fester? And is there something unique about it? And how could we address that in a manner that eradicates those elements? That being said, I also recognize that we live in a political reality in which this isn't exactly a parallel, but I'll just throw it out there as an example. I could I could adopt the idea that anyone who was on the left and questioned the value of capitalism was a hardcore socialist. I could find some label to give them. I could say that anyone who was even remotely supportive of LGBTQ rights was a radical wokist liberal. And I could shackle someone with a label and never really listen to the full, uh, never really understand what they are, who they are, what they actually believe, and funnel my view of them through this very narrow lens of everything can simply be explained by this very odious view that they have that I stand against. And I think sometimes that can be a danger on the left. And as you point out, sometimes even within moderates. I'm not denying that these people exist on the right, but I think there's a real danger in broad brushing it and saying everything they do can be explained through this. As I said earlier, look, I am not a Trump supporter by any stretch. I didn't vote for the guy. I pray to God he does not get back in the White House for a whole host of reasons that could take me a solid hour to get through. um, but I also know people that voted for Donald Trump and love him dearly, and I have no reason to believe they're racist. And I think there is a tendency to say the only reason a person would do X is because of this terrible thing that they must believe. And I don't think there is nearly as many, um, what do we end up with? 40, 50, 60 million. I don't think we have that many tens of millions of Americans whose sole writing purpose in voting for a particular political candidate was their racial motivation. Say, I think it's more complicated. That's certainly in the mix, but it's not the only driving factor. And so I'm trying to be careful to recognize the warts on my side while also not uh, framing this in such a way that it explains more than what it actually does.
Okay. I do hear what you're saying. And I have a final kind of very big question. I'm gonna save for the end. Uh, and this is a sentiment that I've talked about before, and I'm curious to hear your feedback on it. But moving on to the next question, in your words, in if you want to do like a bullet point frame or whatever you want to kind of narrative narration of it, what makes being a conservative, you may have already said this, but I'm going to ask it. What makes being a conservative better than being a liberal or a moderate, in your opinion?
And you're probably right. I've answered it in so many words, but that's a good question. Uh, and I think There could be
If
a
you had
number of things.
a if you had to like give a concrete answer for that.
I think it almost in repeating what we kind of started off with, I think in the moment we live, in the society we live, I think the greatest danger is speed. I think the greatest danger of the way we live is the rate at which we change. And I don't mean in the last 20 years, I mean the last 200 plus years, say, that humanity has seen such advancement. There's, as is often said, the automobile and contraceptions were two inventions that changed how humans behave with each other more than any political program anyone has ever come up with. And the conservative is always concerned about, well, we have developed slowly over time through centuries, if not millennia. We have developed custom and tradition and the way we do life. And when you uproot one generation from the next, very bad things can happen. And so I think the moment we're in calls for, above all else, not a stopping of progress, but a recognition that progress can bring with it danger. And therefore, we need to, while embracing the progress, be very cautious about what the unintended consequences could be. And that's a very, very broad answer because I could obviously go out in 10,000 different directions. But I think that would be my overall argument for why I think conservatism is a healthier and a more civilization stabilizing, say, movement than progressivism or even moderation, is that we are really living in a transitory time period where people are unmoored, where we're very alienated from each other, and that we need to be, with all our might, trying to find ways to conserve the things that tether us to the society we have, while we enjoy the progress rather than letting that progress destroy us.
Very interesting. I do think that we are definitely accelerating in terms of our progress at a faster pace than ever, and obviously that's very much in due to the introduction of the internet and its ability to constantly input more and more information out there, and then all the other technology. And now AI is getting thrown out there, so we're progressing very, very far. Have you ever heard of like the saying that humans are terrible at mitigating and preventing issues, but in terms of adaptation, we excel at it.
I don't
So
know if I've ever
we're
heard the
always,
same, but that makes sense. Yeah.
yeah. I don't think it's the same, but the sentiment is there, right? So at the end of the day, humans will continuously progress more and more, farther and farther, faster and faster. We're gonna have mistakes. Very similar. I've talked about this before. The internet and social media. It was revolutionary in bringing people together, shrinking the planet basically, giving you more information about things that you've ever could know as an individual, just a normal person on the street. The issue that people didn't realize, I wouldn't imagine someone realized this when they created the internet, is that the stuff you mentioned, isolation, because of it, of people being isolated from one another, losing the people skills, so to speak. So the next uh, progression we have to make there is adapting to this issue and finding solutions. My thing is, one, education has to be a very essential part to this. We have to educate people better. I think our education system is very inefficient. Um, Second thing is the next generation of parents, such as myself, we know how the internet works now. So people like me and even my friends, we know, yeah, we're not going to just let our kid just be on the internet and social media all the time. We know how problematic that can be. So the teachings will follow after the experience. And then after that, people will be able to potentially, if the teachings get uh, normalized in terms of United States culture, that hey, teach your kid how to handle social media and technology, then it will be less and less of an issue moving down the line, right? So I think for the most part, a lot of these problems are definitely problems, and we should definitely find ways to fix it. And I think as humans, we can. Now, I do think there may be a problem in the future that is so bad that we ain't gonna be able to adapt to it. We see, for example, let's throw out the extreme example with the AI stuff. If the Terminator happens, then we're screwed. So, I do think people overreact in terms of AI and its current process, but if AI ever takes a certain step too far, then that may be really bad. So we always have to pay attention to that. So there are definitely things out there like that for sure. I do, but in general, I do think humanity's adaptation capabilities are very much there. Um, so my next
Well,
question,
do you mind if I respond to that right quick?
yeah,
Is that
go for it.
in terms of what
Go
we're
for it.
talking? Because excellent points, and I agree. Humans as a species, we're really good at adapting. But it takes us a long time, and if we think of the a prior era in our nation that's somewhat similar to what we're going through today is at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, sort of the Gilded Age, right? Where there's this mass increase in productivity and the capacity to do so. Turns out living in that era was terrible, even though I don't think I've yet to hear anybody make the argument why we should go back to a pre-industrial age. Very few people talk about, the real problem is when we invented indoor plumbing. That's when everything went wrong. There's a lot of inventions we have we're very grateful for. But the reality is not only was it very unsettling for the individual, but then come the 19th century, we killed, I think we, through warfare, murdered more people on the planet than in the previous 2,000 years combined using these new tools at our disposal. I mean, there's some pretty terrible things we did to each other. And so I do think humans adapt, but I think most of the time it comes through multiple generations. And so I am hopeful in the long term, but as I often say, you and I might not get to see the long term. And sometimes what we have to do is we have to have sort of a broader view of things, stretching back maybe even thousands of years of saying this is what purpose and hope uh, and my meaning in life is that gets me through this very turbulent time.
Yeah, I definitely think that like I said, there are things out there then that relying on adaptation is not good enough. I definitely agree to that point. I mean, one thing that we constantly have to be aware of is how we use nuclear weapons, for example. Like you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, how our current, how the technology we created in that age killed so many people. Well, now with the current kind of tensions in the world right now, we always have to be wary of not to toe the line before we basically end all of humanity. And so there are definitely things that we need to put more care than others. Um, the question at the end of the day are what issues are those issues that we need to put care in.
Yeah.
And I think for the most part, in terms of current politics, most of the topical issues are not those type of situations. They focus on things that I deem very hey, there's more important things that we could be talking about. For example, right? Um, right now, everybody's just talking about Trump's indictment. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so, but I definitely get what you're saying. So to kind of touch pass on conservatives again, what issues do you believe, or what are the top, let's say, three issues that conservatives advocate for, in your opinion?
Do you mean that I would like for conservatives to advocate for, or
Yeah,
that?
based on
Okay.
your opinion.
Well, so I'll give a mixture of maybe policy and non-policy. I would say, in my view, chief among them is the culture war, but not the way it's currently being fought. When I say culture war, I mean if you go back to say circa 1940s, what exactly was it that allowed for a scenario in which so many men in the United States would storm the beach of Normandy knowing they were likely going to be given their lives? Like, what kind of virtue allowed for that to exist? What sort of a society allowed for that siren's call of freedom and liberty, say, that they would literally willingly give their lives for something like that? And I think a culture has to be healthy before we could ever have any sort of political policy solutions that is going to hope to advance the ball at all. A culture that is healthy can weather something like COVID 19. A culture that is weak cannot. And eventually, one of those crises is going to bring the entire society down. If a culture becomes weak enough, we end up just eating each other. So that's maybe first and foremost. I will be the first to admit, as a conservative, there are very few policy solutions to what ails a culture. So this almost always has to take place on an individual or local level and within the human heart. So that's number one in my view. Uh, Number two, I would say I may be kind of old school at heart with this, but it's the mounting debt in the United States, and it's our inability to rein that in. And I think we have gone so long in this country with being able to live off the borrowed steam of literally borrowed, uh, taxes to be paid back at some point. I don't think that means there's necessarily a cataclysmic or apocalyptic future, but I think what that means is more and more and more it's going to limit our ability to have choices. It's going to limit the things we can put money into, both at an individual level and even federal funding level. And I think that an inability to rein that in control it does two things. One is it just from a financial perspective is destructive, but second, I think it's at heart it shows an inability to live within our means, and that's not the soul of the nation's at rot if we can't just come to terms with that. That's a very broad issue, obviously. Third, I think that Congress is broken, and there's a number of interesting ideas or suggestions as to how we might fix that or address that. And I'm for kind of an experimentation. Some of them kind of radical, like maybe remove the cap on the House of Representatives rather than limit it to the 435. We can make it thousands and thousands so that the odds of you personally knowing your representative increases. It would make it harder to gerrymander because there would be so many of them. Odd idea, interesting. I think, and these there's going to sound kind of weird. I think taking television out of United States Congress would be a move in the right direction. Not taking the journalist out; they could be there. We could hear audio, maybe we could hear obviously written examples of their words, but turning it less into a performative platform where they're all up there on stage, basically running for president. If we're being honest, and instead actually governing, actually legislating, actually doing the job they were sent there to do. There's any number of reforms from how we finance things to how people are elected to how structurally it works within the chambers of Congress once they're there. That's a big subject, obviously, hundreds of thousands of suggestions that could be thrown out there. But those would be the big three. I think our culture has to heal. I think we need to get our debt under control, and I think Congress needs to be mended because it's currently broken and not functioning.
Uh, Very interesting. My I have my question in terms of the third one is in changing the government. Isn't that more of a progressive idea?
It can be. It can be, and that's a very good question. And so it's a. Well, let me put it this way. It is progressive in the sense that if we're changing the structure of something, this is Edmund Burke, who I consider myself to be a Burkean conservative. He was not against change. What he said was we need to recognize the difference between reform and the radical alteration. Are we changing something to protect the integrity of the institution, or are we changing it in such a manner that you no longer recognize the existence of the institution? So, for example, when I mentioned removing the cap of number of representatives, that's a radical change, but the reality is the founding fathers didn't put that cap there. I think they'd be surprised to know we have that it's basically by order of the fire marshal how many people are allowed to be in Congress and not by the original allotment that they had. Maybe a better example, and this is actually one that drives me nuts because we constantly argue about the filibuster. Should we keep it or get rid of it? The editorialist George Will had the best suggestion, I thought, which is his was like neither. Go back to the way it originally worked, which was that if a senator wanted to filibuster something, he had to physically show up in the Senate chambers and he could not stop talking. And second, it shut down the entire Senate. No other business could take place, which basically meant that if a minority felt extremely strongly about a central issue, they could halt it. But they had to pick and choose because there was a cost to filibustering. They couldn't just say, I threatened to filibuster that, therefore we can't talk about it anymore and you need your 66 votes. I don't want to get too far off in the weeds, but I guess I'm saying there are changes that are more reform in nature that get us back to the original intent of what the institution was. There are other changes that try to circumvent, in my view, human nature and are more destructive to the institution.
All right, very interesting. So, my next question here, and this is probably the last two questions,
Okay.
is in terms of the three issues that you advocated for, is it possible, and if it is possible, how are conservatives able to work with liberals and maybe moderates, you can throw them in there, to solve these issues? Is there a way to compromise or is there a way to find a solution with liberals to do this?
I would say on the first solution, the one about culture, it's tough because there are fundamental disagreements between the left and the right over what our culture should look like and where we gather strength from. That being said, there is enough commonality here that, yeah, heck yeah, we could get started. Number one, let's stop trying to own each other. Let's stop trying to embarrass each other. Let's stop pretending as if that's somehow making anybody's life better. And number two, let's find those central values that we do agree on. As far as I can tell, the majority of the left does believe the family needs to be strong and intact. It does believe communities need to be cohesive and not at each other's throats. And I think there's enough inroads there that we could find ways to build communities. And quite frankly, as I said earlier, it doesn't have to be policy. Heck, uh, being a Boy Scout leader does more good than you enacting some law saying everybody has to behave right. In terms of debt, yes, that one's going to be tough. And I really wonder if people our age and younger are going to tackle this differently because I hope this isn't the case, but it might be that when we have to start paying things, when we start living off the borrowed steam, that we might very quickly find ways to work together. This can be challenging, though, because often if you hear we're going to reduce the debt from the left, they talk about military spending. From the right, they talk about entitlements. And I'm open to a conversation about both. Uh, but I think that's sort of where that gets hung up. And so there is a potential for progression. And to be honest with you, I really think the debt issue is very closely tied to the third one, the idea of congressional reform. And I do think that there's area for some common ground between there. Maybe not super common, but I think that there could be some very modest steps forward. Like I mentioned, and this is a radical, I'm not saying this is going to change the world, but getting rid of TV, say in the Senate chambers, that's not a conservative or a liberal idea. That's just an idea. And some conservatives and liberals are all for it and some aren't. But it's those sorts of things that we could find some common ground.
All right, excellent, excellent. From what it sounds like, I definitely think there are commonalities, like you said, that can be uh, met in regard to a lot of the things that you mentioned in terms of the three issues they're referring to. Um, Culture one is definitely going to be difficult, as you could say, but I think for the most part, the general agreement is that there needs to be a family, and family needs to care for one another. Um, Barring out the radicals from either side, I think for the most part, most the general uh, people know the importance of family. So, with that said, definitely could be bridging of gap regarding that. But yeah, the debt situation will be definitely tough. You know, even with stuff with like student loans and everything. You know, more liberals and I have student loans too. So a lot of us want us to get this debt away, but we realize the importance of getting rid of our massive debt as a country. The Congress one will be interesting though. It really, really depends on how much people actually pay attention to what's going on in Congress. And I think probably more conservatives pay attention to liberals in general in terms of the Congress, but that's a very interesting topic. So, my final question, like I said, this is the one I was going to save for last, is why do you believe, or is it possible for, in terms of a person to be able to advocate for their political ideology and statement without the titles? For example, conservative, liberal, progressive, moderate, Republican, Democrat. Are these titles even necessary? And if getting rid of these titles were to happen, would that be beneficial in terms of the dialogue and the discussion?
Is it possible? Yes. Or let me rephrase that. Is it possible to operate without titles? Absolutely. I could have said probably everything I just said to you and taken out the word conservative, right? We're talking about gratitude. We're talking about debt. We're talking about culture. All of these words don't need something like conservative, liberal, and interjected there. These titles can, of course, be a handicap because you could have another air quotes conservative on this show and they're going to sound nothing like me. And they're going to be talking about when they say the culture wars, they literally do mean owning the libs. When they say conservative, they literally do mean putting our faith in Donald Trump, say. I think sometimes I'm a little stubborn because I am insistent. No, this is what conservatism actually means, and it's been hijacked by other figures. I think the term I'd heard I like better actually is classical conservatism, trying to distinguish it between just the political orientation, if you will. All of that being said, I don't um, I don't think humans are ever going to be able to adapt that fully. And this, you take this out of politics, put it anywhere, we generalize everything. It's just how our brains work. And we can work against it, and we can enjoy nuance, and we can try to see what's best in each other. But I think at the end of the day, we're not going to be able to completely get rid of this. As I often say, I don't like the paradigm of the left versus right, because I don't know if you're familiar with this or not. Do you know where that comes from, by the way, the left and the right? The
No.
historical context? It literally has to do with whether or not, when you're in the French National Assembly, you sat to King Louis's left or right. And if you were to his left, it meant you wanted a liberal system in which the king was more a figurehead, and it was more like a parliamentary system that ran things. And if you were to his right, you were a monarchist. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't have a huge opinion on whether or not we should be a French monarchy or classical liberal society. What the heck that has to do with American politics, I don't know. But we adopted that system in a sense, and so a lot of what we've been talking about, it's almost impossible to squeeze this into this left-right sliding scale as if everything could be understood in that paradigm. That being said, I use the phrase left and right because we immediately have some general notion of what we mean by that.
Yeah.
So I'm for people diving into the nuance of the terms they mean. I'm for people saying, I'm a conservative, I'm going to find out what that means. And maybe they find out, oh, I'm not a conservative. That's not what that word, that's not what I thought that word meant. I guess I'm this other thing. But I don't think we're ever going to eradicate this because that's just what humans do.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I agree. In terms of the kind of titles, although I do think a lot of these titles are useless and inefficient. I like I've said before, I like to focus on the topic at hand, the discussion, what is actually being said. I don't really care about your political ideology or where your stance is in terms of the left or right. But unfortunately, when I put out content there, when I say something that's advocating that if they're adult, they can do whatever they want in terms of transitioning, people call me a lefty. And then if I go like, hey, I don't want to give away all the guns, people call me a righty. So I was like, I don't identify as either of those things, to be honest. So it's unfortunate, but people are so quick to assume things and put you in that general category. And then automatically, once they put you in that category, anything you say after that is going to be fallen on deaf ears. Mm-hmm. And that is that's the worst part about it, is that either side will have such a negative and toxic viewpoint of the other side that they won't even engage in anything they are saying. And sometimes it's warranted because sometimes the other side is, just saying a bunch of nonsense. But most of the time, in terms of the topic at hand, if you have just an echo chamber from either side, then there's really no solution that's going to be found in terms of the issues that's going on. It's always better, even though I have the issue with the left and right and all this, it will always be better to have sides competing than one echo chamber, because we all know if there's just one party ruling everything, that's always a recipe for disaster, every single time. So that is all we got for today's episode on talking about what is a conservative and its importance in the United States and society. Do you have any final words before we wrap things up?
I'll just say I enjoyed the conversation, and thank you for asking me questions that made me think. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem. Got your information. Of course, you can check all his stuff out. It's on the website, www.thetrendwithrtlfaith.com. Rate this podcast 5 stars so you can get your review shouted out on the next podcast episode. Appreciate everybody listening, watching. Appreciate you, Josh, for coming on and having the conversation. Of course, y'all have a good one. Take care and peace.